Okay. Well, we better get started. We've gotten to the 12th chapter, and we went through the first part, but to refresh our memories, Paul says, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Now, we spent most of last week on that, but now Paul is going to begin to make some specific suggestions of what that means to discern what is good and acceptable and perfect. And then he goes on in 3 through 8 and says, For by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought to think, but think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned. For as in one body we have many members, and not all the members have the same function, so we who are many are one body in Christ, and individually we are members one of another. We have gifts that differ according to the grace given to us: prophecy in proportion to faith, ministry in ministering, the teacher in teaching, the exhorter in exhortation, the giver in generosity, the leader in diligence, the compassionate in cheerfulness. So, he's getting a little more specific of what these understandings of transforming your mind and discerning God's will. And these specifics of renewing one's mind, the first thing is, do not think too highly of yourself. Does anybody struggle with that problem? In yourself or in others? William Barclay reminds us that in the Greek world and in Greek philosophy, and I'm pretty sure it's Plato, or was it or Socrates, great first principle of wisdom is to know thyself. An honest assessment of oneself is so important for healthy relationships and for happiness in life. It's so important for success in life, in our career choice. Know thyself in sense of what your career choice will be and your career development. Knowing oneself, what you can do and do well, what you cannot do and what you cannot do well are very important. A big aspect is simply being able to accept the reality with humility. I mean, there are some folks that, yeah, I can do that, I can do that wonderfully well, and yet cannot accept the reality that someone else can do it a lot better. You should step aside and let someone else do that instead of hanging on and trying to control everything. However, sometimes we sell ourselves short. We may not have had time to try out some of our gifts, some of our talents and abilities that may not have been recognized before, have not been trained and developed quite yet. There was once a study that I can't remember exactly how it went, but they interviewed a whole bunch of kindergartners and asked them all these questions. Can you do this? Can you do that? And all of them said, yes, I can do that, I can do that. And then when they were in the 5th grade, they went back to the same group of kids and asked them the same question, can you do this, can you do that? And nearly all of them said no. In that many years, they had lost this sense of self-confidence, and part of the study, I believed, was that the drop in confidence came by there's too much criticism that they've received when they began to try things, and the grading system. Anything you do immediately is graded. And if you can't get the star or the A+, all of a sudden it often becomes discouraging. Well, I can't do that well, so I'm no good at it. Rather than realizing you're just beginning. You can't do it perfectly when you're just beginning. So, too little thought sometimes can make someone feel like they can't do something because they haven't yet explored it yet and given it some try to find out. And so that kind of blocks and impedes one discovering one's gifts and abilities. Another problem with thinking too little of oneself is in our culture, this whole idea of being number one, being the best. And we get this, it's all or nothing kind of thing. If you can't be the best, then, well, I don't need to try. And so, as I remember in athletics, it is so often the case that number 2 and number 3 are the ones pushing number 1 to improve and succeed and excel because someone is hot on their heels. And so there is an important role for the number 2 or the number 3. I was a good athlete, and when I was in the 8th grade, the coach wanted me to run the half mile in a track meet. So I ran the half mile, and when I was crossing the finish line, 220 yards behind me, halfway around the track, was number 2. I was 2 seconds off of a record. But there's nobody hot on my heels pushing me to get that extra 2 or 3 seconds quicker. And then I had injuries, and I didn't get a chance to run it as a 9th grader and maybe break that record. So anyway, the second or third are always pushing the other to excel. And sometimes, number 1 may have a bad day, and I have a great day, and you do well, and you get to win one. But anyway, being the best sometimes discourages people because they don't feel like they can be the best, so they think, well, there's no sense in trying. But anyway, when I was young and felt a sense of calling to the ministry in the 9th grade, I spent the next few years under the leadership and the example of some very great preachers. Finus Crutchfield was in the church at McFarland when I was growing up, and some of you remember Finus was really a dynamic preacher, and then Dr. Poe Williams followed him, and Poe was really great. And then all of these preachers that I listened to, and particularly I went to college then, still exploring and thinking about this sense of call to ministry. And there was a powerful preacher there who had 3 services on Sunday, filled the sanctuary, had to have closed-circuit TV to fill the basement. And so at the 11 o'clock service, and it wasn't a small church, it was First Methodist in Lawrence, Kansas, and all these great preachers were actually very discouraging to me in thinking about a call to ministry. They made me feel like I can never measure up. There's no way I can do that. But then one Sunday, at McFarland back there, the regular preacher was on vacation, and a substitute minister brought the sermon. Now, I won't say who he was because he's still living, but he did not come close to measuring up to the regular preacher's performance. But he became a very critical factor in my sense of calling to the ministry, because I realized he's not a great preacher. But in his specialized ministry, he is a very effective minister. So being a great, dynamic, crowd-drawing preacher isn't the only criteria for effective ministry. And so I continue to not discard that sense of calling. But this not-so-good guy made all the difference in my staying with pursuing the ministry. And I haven't gotten fired yet. So, anyway, the whole point of that is counteracting this idea that we have to be the best if we're going to try to use a gift. Sometimes we don't have to be the best, and we're still effective and can still have a powerful influence. Along the way, I have heard some great preachers who never made it to the big time, so to speak. They never got an appointment in a big church and with large attendance, but nevertheless they were really powerful preachers. But they were relegated to small churches because of church politics. One that I'm thinking of in particular, the bishop hated him, and so he kept appointing him to these little rural churches. But yet he was a powerful preacher and really inspirational. And sometimes some are great preachers, but they lack a few of the other important gifts of ministry necessary to be effective in pastoring a church. And those other pastoral and leadership skills were missing. And so they're a great preacher, but they couldn't take care of their church for one or another reason. And in athletics, it's, like I said, the second and third place runners or teams that do push and challenge the number one to do better. But Paul's not thinking about athletics, and he's focused on serving God and being a part of a leadership in the local church. When he says, don't think of yourselves more highly than you ought, it's not so much an evaluation of your performance at the task, but rather your importance and significance within the community that Paul is dealing with here. It can mean the feeling that he's saying, don't think so highly of yourself, in the sense of deserving a higher place of honor or deserving more prestige. It can become a power struggle of whose will and whose desires will be followed in community decision making. For example, I've been here long enough, I have served, I've given the most money, so by golly, I'm going to decide what color carpet is going to be in the sanctuary. And I love bright green. So as the path gets worn here, next time we decide, I'm going to pull my weight and I'm going to say green has to be the color. Anyway, that's kind of a contemporary power struggle. But Barclay is really dealing with something that can happen in churches with this kind of don't think so highly of yourself, more highly than you ought, in terms of who decides on the music. That's a big issue in church today, or who decides who leads the worship service, who's going to lead the prayers, and who is going to decide how many services and when we have the services and so forth. A lot of important decisions are made, but then who gets to make them? Particularly if it comes down to we got to decide, it's about 50-50. We got to do something. Who is going to decide? Who has the biggest vote? It's kind of like, I use the expression with the bishop and the cabinet on appointments. So often, we hear the cabinet has gotten together and they're deciding on, who's going to go where and who's going to be appointed where. And it's supposed to be a consultation process. Consult with the pastor. Do you want to stay? You want to move? And consult with congregations. What kind of leadership are you needing? You need a good person with the youth, or a good person to work with the older folks, or, you need to build a new church. You need someone who's good at raising money and whatever. But when it comes down to the decision, the bishop gets the biggest vote. The whole cabinet could think one way, but the bishop could think another. And so the bishop does have authority to do that. But sometimes within a local church, some people might think they're so important, they're like a bishop over the church, the congregation, and they should decide. They have the longest experience, they have the deepest faith, or whatever. And this is the kind of thing Paul is saying, don't think too highly of yourself, because that attitude can be divisive within the life of the church. He also, says about exaggerated conceit or false modesty. And there's another part of having false modesty where one does not step up and make oneself available to leadership. As I was come along in the ministry, I noticed a few clergy who not only had an apparent conceit about their abilities, but also were obviously very ambitious. Now, what bothered me about some of those characters was not so much their ambition, but rather their theological orientation and their values and priorities regarding the direction the church should be going. And they were pushing and striving for leadership in the church to work their will and their way. Where I and some others felt like that isn't the way the church should be going. Those aren't the values that we understand as traditional United Methodist. And so I realized I wasn't feeling the ambition, but I did feel that I needed to prepare myself and be willing and ready to accept leadership if that would be something that would develop or happen. And so I did do some things where I made myself present and available and involved in some of the conference, not necessarily politics, but some of the conference meetings and programs. Now, I didn't get asked to be a DS or, something like that, but, and it didn't work out that I got something big, but at the time I felt like this false modesty, or I'm going to step back and not present myself because I don't want to appear to be ambitious and self-serving, but yet I didn't want to just turn the church over to those who were ambitious and self-serving. So that's another thing that Paul is dealing with. Don't let others walk all over you and control the church if it's not the right thing that we understand. So Paul uses the image of the body, the physical body, as an organism with many parts and organs that do many different things that enable the whole body to function in a healthy way. he uses this metaphor to counteract the spiritual arrogance that has arisen in the early churches. Some had come to believe some of the gifts of the Spirit placed them in a kind of first-class Christian status, or even more divisive in the church, and held out the belief with those special gifts, those certain gifts of the Spirit, that if you didn't have them, somehow you weren't a real Christian, and only those who have the gift are a real Christian. You know, the part of the thing where a lot of people ask, are you a born-again Christian? Have you been confronted with that? And the assumption is if you have not, you're not a real Christian. So what is this born-again thing? You know, we don't preach that and work that and demand that and try to encourage that kind of thinking in our tradition here, but it comes also to, you know, this idea of being truly saved, as it were. In New Testament times, as evidenced by Paul's letters and the metaphor of the body, one of the divisive issues was this glossolalia, or speaking in tongues, sometimes called a second baptism, a gift of the Spirit, and that's the way you demonstrate that you have received that. And the Holy Spirit descending on Jesus at his water baptism by John, when he came up out of the water, the Spirit descended on him like a dove, and that's a kind of image that there's water baptism and then this Holy Spirit baptism that some will, you know, try to develop into a class system. Some have only received water baptism, but then there's a special group that have received this second baptism, a baptism of the Spirit. Not always, but often it. Right, often it will that someone thinks now they've had this real dramatic experience. They were not fully a Christian before. They've made this great transition to being a real Christian, and so their former baptism isn't adequate anymore. They feel like they need to go be rebaptized. Or they're looking for and equating in traditions with the believer's baptism. When you have a big conversion experience and you come from being not a Christian to becoming a Christian, then you celebrate that great event and experience with a baptism. So you may have been baptized before, but then you have this great renewal experience and think, well, with the believer's baptism and their transformation, now I've had a transformation. It follows I need to be baptized. But you've already been baptized. Well, that doesn't count because I wasn't a real Christian back then. Now I'm a real Christian because I've had this experience. So now I need a real baptism. And maybe I had a sprinkling before. Now I need an immersion baptism. So we get those kind of thoughts and dynamics going on.
Born again is mostly charismatic faith, religions or faiths, but how does a Methodist clergy handle it if somebody comes in and they're wanting born again in the Methodist faith? Does that happen?
Yeah, sometimes they want to be rebaptized. But my answer to that is a baptism is really an initiation rite into the faith. A part of it is the profession of faith. If it's an infant baptism, it's the profession of faith of the parents and their commitment to raise the child in the faith and expose them to the Christian teachings and the Christian community and so forth until the age at which they can claim the faith for themselves. Then instead of being baptized again, we have confirmation. service. Now, in that same kind of thought, I say the baptismal rite is not appropriate for a renewal of faith experience, but we don't want to say you can't do anything. We can do another confirmation of this stage and step. You had one earlier, you're having another, or we could just do a celebration service to celebrate what has happened in your life, giving God thanks and praise for all the influences that led up to your being receptive and available for this event to occur that moved you so, and give you and celebrate that, but also, which should be a part of it, your rededication to the way of Christ. Now that you've had the experience, you want to make that commitment and that dedication much stronger. And so maybe in this celebration, you may have thought of, now you have a call to ministry. Or you want to change your life from maybe changing your career because you felt like, no offense to anybody who happens to, but you're working in a liquor store or you're being a bartender and you've had this experience. And now you're seeing how alcohol is so dangerous to so many people's lives, not to everybody's, but you don't want to be a part of encouraging and helping someone fall into the pit of self-destruction. And so you decide, I've got to leave that career. I need to find something else. And so that could be a part of that sense of dedication and changing the direction of my life. It's a big decision. We want to celebrate that with you and affirm it and confirm what's happened. But getting rebaptized isn't the right ritual, because it's a ritual for coming into the faith for the first time. It's an initiation into the church. You were already in the church. We're not going to kick you out and then readmit you kind of thing. Although someone may have self-separated and now they're coming back, but nevertheless, we can't cancel God's love and God's claim on us. But anyway, that's a good question. But anyway, this kind of thing of the struggle and working out what are the important gifts and graces within the life of the church was going on in Paul's time. And these ecstatic and emotional charged experiences were being held up as giving some a more superior gift and having God in their lives in a more powerful way. And so Paul is saying, do not think more highly of yourself and superior to in comparison with others in the body of Christ, because all are necessary and all are helpful. So the first thing he's talking about in terms of transformation of your mind and heart and discerning what is God's will comes the right attitude about your gifts and your place in the church and your relationship with God and that status, either to be recognized as superior or having more power. And Paul says, no, don't think that way. He emphasizes that faith is a gift from God. And he says, don't think so highly of yourself, but think with sober judgment. And I think this concept of sober judgment is to kind of come down from your emotional and exuberant high when you think about yourself and your place and your role in the life of the church, and realize that whatever you have is a gift from God and to be thankful. And whatever you have, if it comes from God as a gift, you've not earned it or worked for it, and you don't have a right to claim special status or recognition because it's all about God, not about you. And with the gift, and he's coming to this that that follows, with the gift comes responsibility to use that gift according to God's will to build up the church, to strengthen the body of Christ with what you do. Now, no matter how great or small, how glorified or humble the gifts are, all are equally important and significant, regardless of how much or how little praise and recognition you get. If it's a gift from God, and if it's faithfully used for the good, then it's kind of like the idea of virtue is its own reward. Being able to be a part of the church and to see that your gift is important and is making a good thing happen should make you happy. And you shouldn't have to let your involvement be based upon how much credit or thankfulness you receive. But just knowing should be enough is kind of what Paul's saying. However, it is reassuring and encouraging to be recognized and thanked. When we work real hard and nobody seems to appreciate it, and sometimes folks are critical and don't like what we've done, you can decide, well, I'm not sure it's worth it. But anyway, so Paul says that we each have gifts, but that they differ according to the grace God bestows upon you. And the word that he's using is charisma, and that's the root word that is used in the charismatic or charismatic movement that was isolating these gifts of the Spirit that are exuberation or speaking in tongues and so forth. That was a big part of that movement a few decades ago, and it did create a little bit of disunity in the church. But an underlying issue was a sense of enthusiasm and a strong emotional commitment to the faith that a lot of charismatics felt was missing from the church, and that they were inspired and enthused, and so to agree they were right. But on the other hand, too much emphasis on emotion and all this excitement and so forth would sometimes leave aside reason and tradition and sometimes theology in this emotional preaching and the lyrics and of some of the songs that were coming out that were not solid theology, and sometimes were expressing things that were in error and in this exuberance, going too far with that. And so it needed to be pulled back some. The gifts, but sometimes folks thought that their whole experience was being criticized and not recognized, when it wasn't so much that, it just what was coming out of it often went too far in the theological ideas and some of the expressions of importance that, if you don't have this, then you're not a real Christian kind of stuff. Well, Paul's gifts lists, when he starts listing them, the first one that comes out is prophecy. And you think, well, why would prophecy be at the top of the list? Well, first of all, we need to understand what prophecy means in these biblical terms. And in most of the Old Testament, and especially in the New Testament, prophecy rarely has the meaning that so often we assign to it as fortune-telling or predicting the future. Prophecy in the basic biblical sense, means speaking God's truth. If we remember a lot of the introductions of the prophets, thus saith the Lord. Your ways are not my ways. Anyway, so the prophet is God's spokesperson. So it's appropriate for that understanding to be at the top of the list, to be the top priority in Paul's list, if it's understood that way. And we believe that's what he is understanding. The second is diakonia. In Greek, it means practical service or ministering. In the New Revised Standard Version translation, it's using ministry or ministering, and we might say in caring or serving the real needs of the congregation. It goes back to the widows and the orphans, the sick and the dying, and it could mean, in that sense, pastoral care, counseling, as well as physically helping with basic needs for survival. It's interesting that the acts of compassion and caring are second after speaking God's truth in the prophecy thing. Third comes teaching. And teaching is different from the proclamation of God's spokesperson. Teaching involves explaining so that what is proclaimed might be really understood and that it makes sense, it's grasped. But it also means explaining how we take that truth of what God is saying into ourselves and work out what it means for what we should do and how we should live with a concept in a conceptual way. Trying to motivate us to go do it then would be the exhortation that comes next. But anyway, teaching also means telling the stories of our tradition, how we came to be this people. You know, what is our heritage? Who are our heroes? What have been our failures? What have been our successes as a people? What has been our history with God? Where did our people experience God through the past? What is our history? Or those are things that need to be taught. Teaching involves also coaching and helping people perform the acts of worship and prayer properly, so that prayer and worship open us to God's presence and the indwelling Spirit. A lot of times people don't know how to do that or what's expected, and that's where teaching comes in. And then, as I said, the exhortation follows, and that's to be the cheerleader, the encourager, the motivational speaker, if you will. And exhortation, unfortunately, sometimes comes across as threatening, the hellfire and damnation kind of thing, or shaming, the put down. A lot of times might imagine sometimes, coaches yelling at the players and trying to put them down in some way in order to shame them as a way of encouraging them to try harder. But we know that usually that's not very effective in the long run. It may work in a short run, but if it's happening all the time, it's ineffective. It needs to be positive, and that's why we keep returning and calling the gospel good news, not bad news, in order to exhort or encourage. The fifth thing he listed was giving or sharing, and that virtue is generosity. It's the spiritual gift of the Spirit that is selfless in regard to material things and possessions. The person is not focused on acquiring and gaining wealth, but one sees money as a tool that can be used either for my benefit or as a tool that can help others in some way. And that when one wants to do that, then that's a positive element in the life of the church. Now, today, we live in a very advanced and complicated world where millions of people are in drastic need. And there are so many refugees and immigrants displaced by wars and droughts and economic crises that simply going to your pantry and getting a sack of food to try to help with those situations isn't very effective. If we were a small village and we knew a family in the village that was in need, then going to our pantry and getting some food to help would be effective. But our world is so complicated today that we need other ways and channels to respond with our generosity and our care in order to be helpful. It's very, very frustrating because situations tear at our hearts, and it's so far away, and we wish we could help, but we don't have a clear path very often. But one good thing is that with the growth of the church and the development of ways our missions can help, we do have channels in the United Methodist Church for getting help and aid to places, and we take up special offerings and so forth. But even locally, so often we need structures and channels to be effective in the things that we want to do to try to help. The sixth one comes leadership, and in the New Revised Version, it translates the qualifying characteristic of leadership as diligence. Now, Barclay translates leadership not diligence, but with zeal, which is meaning enthusiasm. And I believe what Paul is meaning is accepting responsibility of leadership with a strong desire to do the job. Not as, well, if nobody else will do it, I guess I'll do it. But rather, that job needs to be done. And I want to do it because I see a way for doing it well and doing it with enthusiasm so that the result that I can envision, I want to see it happen. And with that kind of enthusiasm, it's not something that's put off to the last minute and it's last on the list behind all the other things that we would rather do ourselves. So enthusiasm or zeal is what Barclay's trying to get at to capture Paul's meaning. The seventh then comes to compassion, that the New Revised Standard Version translates. This compassion as a gift of the Spirit that some people possess, and it translates the quality of compassion or the flavor of compassion that Paul wants to be displayed as cheerfulness. Now, I tried to figure out when I was reading that, what does that mean? And C.K. Barrett in his commentary explains it, this one, with the example of compassion for the poor can be shown by giving alms. And we can remember Scrooge. And the poor people come and they want alms. And he yells at them. But one can have that attitude, but out of a sense of duty, well, all right, here are a few coins. But have this grudging and judgmental, critical attitude about the person in need, blaming the victim, but still doing the compassionate act of giving a little aid. But rather, Paul is saying, for your own spiritual attitude, you should do so cheerfully. I'm glad to help. I feel blessed that I was here with this opportunity to share. to be of help. I feel so blessed that I was given that opportunity. And so that's the attitude that Paul is saying that needs to be happening in the life of the church. Because not only does it affect our spirit in relationship with God, but it'll then affect our relationship with others. Even though a person has the need and would be thankful for getting some help, but that emotional weight of the judgmentalism and the grudgingness of it will leave them feeling bad about themselves and their situation, instead of encouraged that there's help, I can overcome this, I can see a way through this, and then build the relationship. Is there more I can do rather than just giving you the money? Are there other things that can be done where we can help you overcome this situation that's placed you in need? So anyway, if we just read through those things and don't just hurry on through for the next chapter and live with them a moment, then we can allow these words of Paul to speak to us in our life and faith. So let us pray. Dear God, we do thank you for all the ways that you bless us, and because we've been blessed, we are enabled to be a blessing to others, but especially as we hear Paul's words about the gifts of your grace to each one of us and how we can be a part of the life of the church, serving in our special ways. Help us discern what those might be, and also discern how we need to be in the way we serve. In Christ's name, amen. Until next week.